President Biden published an op-ed in Washington Post today calling for three big changes. And the first is a constitutional amendment to limit presidential immunity. Now, this is in response to the recent Supreme Court decision that held that presidents are immune from any official acts committed while they're in office. So this would limit that immunity. Now, remember, amendments are really hard. They require 2/3 of the House and the Senate and then ratification by 3/4 of the state legislatures. There's a reason why we haven't done this since 1992, because it's really hard. So this one is probably just dead in the water. Now, the second is actually term limits for the Supreme Court. Currently, there are no term limits for the Supreme Court. You serve until you die or you retire. Now, the average length of tenure is about 16 years for Supreme Court justices, but you can go as long as 30 years on the Supreme Court. So he's asking for 18-year term limits with the ability of presidents to appoint a new Supreme Court justice every 2 years. Currently, it's really random when there are vacancies on the Supreme Court because, again, it's up to retirement or death. So this would introduce some regularity to appointments for the Supreme Court. Now, what's strange here is this op-ed didn't clarify whether this would apply to the current Supreme Court, whether it would be like retroactively applied or only for future Supreme Court justices. And then he didn't call for an amendment. And that's really strange because you would need an amendment to create term limits for the Supreme Court in the same way that you need an amendment to create term limits for the presidency. And again, amendments are really hard. Now, there are some big arguments here. Do you set term limits for the Supreme Court? Would this limit the credibility or the independence of the Supreme Court? And I think the answer to this is no. No, it would be fine. 18 years seems like a very long time to serve on the court, to give it that kind of long tenure in office that gives it a sense of authority. So no, I don't buy that argument at all. And it would introduce some more regularity. And when you're voting for presidents, you also are going to get at least 2 picks on the Supreme Court. Okay. And then the third is an enforceable code of ethics for the Supreme Court. Currently, all federal judges who are not on the Supreme Court are held to a code of ethics. The Supreme Court just adopted a code of ethics back in November, but it was not enforceable, so it's practically useless. This is calling for Congress to create a code of ethics that would be enforceable for the Supreme Court on things like disclosing gifts and limiting political activity and recusing yourself when a spouse is involved. Well, okay, I have some questions here constitutionally. Congress has the power to impeach all members of the federal judiciary. True. What would be involved here with a code of ethics? Would it simply provide guidelines on when to introduce impeachment articles? Because I'm not exactly sure what enforcement mechanism Congress could create to punish violations of the code of ethics outside of impeachment constitutionally. So that's the big question there. Now, that one would not require, unless it's going to be an enforcement mechanism outside of impeachment, that would not require a constitutional amendment. But the first 2 changes that Biden is calling for would require a constitutional amendment and are therefore very unlikely. Though I think a great swath of Americans would support some kind of term limit on the Supreme Court. The question is, do you want term limits? Do you want age limits? That's the big question today. So I'd like to hear your thoughts. What do you think about Biden's big 3 changes?